Joaquín Guzmán. The world would one day know him as El Chapo, the short man who cast a giant shadow over global drug trafficking. But before the helicopters, the manhunts, and the tunnels, there was a boy born into grinding poverty in a forgotten corner of Mexico. He came into the world on April 4th, 1957, in La Tuna, a small village in the rugged municipality of Betrayal, Sinaloa. This was not a place of opportunity. Sinaloa's jagged mountains and arid valleys were home to subsistence farmers who eked out a living from the soil. The homes were little more than shacks, and the children often went to bed hungry. Joaquín's family was no different. His father, Emilio Guzmán, worked as a subsistence farmer and also dabbled in growing opium poppies and marijuana, crops that were more profitable than corn or beans. His mother, Maria Consuelo, tried to hold the family together. From the beginning, poverty defined Guzmán's childhood. He stopped attending school after the 3rd grade. Instead, he worked in the fields, tending to marijuana and poppy plants alongside his father. He was small in stature, but people noticed he was tireless, stubborn, and ambitious. He earned the nickname El Chapo, Shorty, because of his height, which never reached more than 5 feet 6 inches. In these mountains, however, respect came not from size but from cunning, and Joaquín was already learning lessons about survival. By his teenage years, Guzmán was selling oranges, candies, and sodas in the local town plaza to make ends meet. When his father's temper drove him out of the house, Joaquín built his own hut out of discarded tin sheets and wood. Independence came early. Life in La Tuna taught him 2 things the government could not provide, and the drug trade could. For generations, Betrayal had been known as the cradle of Mexican drug lords. From these valleys, entire families turned to the cultivation of narcotics destined for the United States. For a boy like Guzmán, the path was almost inevitable. In the 1970s, as Joaquín entered his 20s, drug trafficking in Mexico was changing. Colombian cartels like Medellin and Cali dominated the cocaine business, but they needed reliable routes through Mexico to reach the United States. Sinaloa was strategically placed, rugged, remote, and close to the U.S. border. The region's young men became ideal recruits for smuggling networks. Guzmán began working with local traffickers, first as a driver and later as a logistics man. He quickly earned a reputation for discipline and efficiency. Unlike many others, he didn't drink heavily, he didn't use drugs, and he never missed an opportunity to expand his influence. His first real mentor was Pedro Avilés P.A. known as the Lion of Sinaloa. Avilés was one of the pioneering Mexican traffickers, moving marijuana and heroin northward. Guzmán learned under him how shipments were organized, how routes were protected, and how bribes kept the authorities away. When Avilés was killed in a shootout with Mexican federal police in the late 1970s, Guzmán sought new alliances. That opportunity came with Miguel Ingel F.A. Lix Gallardo, the man who would be remembered as the godfather of Mexican drug trafficking. Gallardo was the founder of the Guadalajara Cartel, and he was expanding rapidly by partnering with Colombian suppliers. Guzmán became one of his trusted lieutenants. His job was to ensure that shipments moved smoothly from Sinaloa through Guadalajara and up to the border. If a truckload of cocaine failed to arrive, Guzmán had a reputation for punishing drivers personally. Associates recalled that he once shot a smuggler for losing a load, a sign of his ruthlessness even at an early stage. But Guzmán was more than a thug with a gun. He was a strategist. He understood the importance of diversification, using planes, boats, and elaborate concealment methods. One of his hallmarks became the construction of sophisticated tunnels under the U.S.-Mexico border, allowing massive amounts of narcotics to move undetected. These methods would later define the Sinaloa cartel's dominance. By the mid-1980s, Guzmán was no longer a mere lieutenant. The Guadalajara cartel began fragmenting after the infamous kidnapping and murder of U.S. DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in 1985. The Mexican government, under U.S. pressure, cracked down hard on Felix Gallardo's empire. Gallardo was arrested in 1989, and the once unified Guadalajara cartel shattered into regional factions. Out of this chaos rose the Sinaloa cartel, and Joaquín Guzmán positioned himself as one of its leaders. Sinaloa was not just a cartel, it was a federation. Guzmán partnered with men like Ismael, El Mayo, Zambada, and Echecator, El Guero, Palma, pooling resources and dividing territories. Guzmán took charge of operations in Pacific states, controlling routes that stretched from Central America through Mexico and into the U.S. He built clandestine airstrips in the mountains, bought warehouses across the border, and paid off Mexican officials to ensure protection. Despite his growing power, Guzmán never forgot his roots. In Badiraguato, he became known as a benefactor, giving out cash, paying for fiestas, and helping families in need. Some villagers saw him as a Robin Hood figure, even as he ordered killings and trafficked tons of drugs. This dual image, feared criminal and folk hero, would stay with him throughout his life. By the early 1990s, El Chapo was a recognized name in both Mexican and U.S. intelligence circles. He was considered one of the most dangerous traffickers in the Western Hemisphere. His cartel was moving cocaine from Colombia, marijuana and heroin from Mexico, and methamphetamine into the U.S. at unprecedented levels. He had assassins, accountants, pilots, and politicians on his payroll, and yet he operated largely from the shadows, letting his myth grow through whispers and the occasional bloody headline. But with notoriety came danger. Rival cartels, such as the Tijuana cartel led by the Arellano Felix brothers, saw Guzmán as a threat. Government agencies, both Mexican and American, were beginning to share intelligence, and in 1993 fate caught up with him. That year, he was arrested in Guatemala after a bloody confrontation and extradited back to Mexico. For the first time, El Chapo's name appeared across international headlines. He had been captured, but his story was far from over. This first chapter closes with Guzmán behind bars, yet still in command. Even from a cell, he found ways to manage his empire. The boy, who had once sold oranges in the plaza of Badiraguato, had become one of the most feared men in the Americas. His rise was meteoric, but it was only the beginning. The world was about to learn that El Chapo Guzmán was not just a drug lord. He was an escape artist, a strategist, and a criminal mastermind whose legend was still being written. When Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was captured in Guatemala in 1993 and sent to Mexico, many thought it was the end of his reign. But in truth, it was only a pause. Even behind bars, his influence seeped into the cracks of the prison walls. Through bribes, coded messages, and loyal associates, he continued to manage the flows of drugs across borders. His first imprisonment would become less a downfall and more a staging ground for the next, more dangerous phase of his career, the rise of the Sinaloa Cartel. The seeds of that cartel had already been planted years earlier, when Guzmán and his partners, Sheikter, El Guerrero, Palma, and Ismael, El Mayo, Zambada, decided that fragmentation was strength. With the Guadalajara cartel shattered after the arrest of Miguel Angel F.A. Lix Gallardo, a vacuum had formed. Every powerful trafficker scrambled to claim territory. The Arellano F.A. Lix brothers consolidated Tijuana. Amado Carrillo Fuentes became Lord of Juarez. But in the Pacific states, from the coast of Sinaloa to the rugged mountains, Guzmán and his allies began to knit together something more enduring. The Sinaloa cartel was never a monolith. It was a federation, flexible, adaptive, and difficult to dismantle. Guzmán understood that if power was shared, if lieutenants were given their own territories and autonomy, loyalty would follow, while rivals like the Tijuana cartel ruled with fear, often turning inward and killing their own. The Sinaloa alliance emphasized cooperation and long-term profit. Guzmán's genius was logistics. He saw the drug trade as a business, one that demanded efficiency, innovation, and ruthlessness only when necessary. His innovations were legendary. In the early 1990s, he pioneered the construction of tunnels under the U.S.-Mexico border. These were not crude holes in the earth. They were feats of engineering, complete with lighting, ventilation, and rails to move carts full of narcotics. One of the first major tunnels was discovered in Douglas, Arizona, running nearly 300 feet from a warehouse in Mexico to a house in the United States. Authorities were stunned at the sophistication. For Guzmán, it was merely the beginning. He also revolutionized concealment techniques. Drugs were smuggled inside cans of jalapeno peppers, in fire extinguishers, even molded into plastic figurines. Tractor trailers carried false compartments. Commercial airliners were loaded with suitcases packed with cocaine. Bribed airport officials, turning a blind eye. On the seas, fishing boats and cargo ships moved tons of narcotics disguised as legitimate goods. To the outside world, El Chapo seemed to be everywhere at once, always a step ahead of the authorities. Money flowed in staggering quantities. In the 1990s, the U.S. appetite for cocaine was insatiable. Colombian cartels needed distribution networks, and Guzmán provided them. Every year, billions of dollars worth of drugs crossed the border, and a significant portion went through Sinaloa channels. Guzmán's cartel became not just a supplier, but a dominant player, dictating terms to Colombians themselves. At his peak, it was estimated that El Chapo moved 25% of all illegal drugs entering the United States. With power came bloodshed. Rival cartels wanted to crush him, particularly the Tijuana cartel, led by the Arellano F.A. Lix brothers. The feud between Guzmán and the Tijuana faction became one of the bloodiest cartel wars in Mexico's history. In 1993, Tijuana gunmen attempted to assassinate Guzmán at the Guadalajara airport. Their bullets struck not him, but a cardinal of the Catholic Church, Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, whose death shocked the nation. Suddenly, El Chapo was not just a trafficker, but a fugitive whose actions reverberated in politics and religion. After his arrest later that year, many expected his network to collapse. But it did not. From his prison cell, Guzmán issued orders, coordinated shipments, and kept his lieutenants in line through an endless stream of bribes. Mexican prisons were riddled with corruption. Guards carried his messages, officials looked away, and entire sections of the facility bent to his will. It was from this position that he plotted his famous 2001 escape, smuggled out in a laundry cart. That escape would cement his legend, but more importantly, it placed him once again at the helm of a growing empire. Once free, Guzmán moved with astonishing speed. He consolidated the Sinaloa cartel into the most powerful criminal syndicate in the Americas. By then, his federation had absorbed smaller groups, pushing rivals out of critical border crossings. The cartel's reach extended south into Central America, where cocaine shipments from Colombia were funneled northward. In Guatemala, Honduras, and Panama, Sinaloa emissaries struck deals, bribed police, and secured safe passage. Inside Mexico, Guzmán's influence spread deep into politics. He understood that money opened more doors than violence ever could. Mayors, police commanders, even governors, all became part of his payroll. A phrase became synonymous with his business model: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe or face the bullet. Most chose the silver. The early 2000s marked the height of his power. He diversified beyond cocaine into methamphetamine, which could be produced domestically in clandestine labs. Meth would become a key driver of profits, expanding markets in both the United States and Asia. Marijuana and heroin continued to flow as staples, but it was cocaine and meth that built the cartel's billion-dollar foundation. In his home state, Guzmán was both feared and admired. He paid for roads, schools, and clinics, winning the loyalty of communities that shielded him from authorities. Mothers spoke of him as a protector. Young men dreamed of joining his ranks, and musicians wrote narco corridos, folk ballads glorifying his exploits. To the government, he was a criminal. To many in Sinaloa, he was a patron. But no empire rises without enemies. The Mexican government, often under U.S. pressure, launched a series of offensives aimed at capturing or killing cartel leaders. Rival groups, like the Beltran-Leyva brothers, once his allies, split away and declared war on him. The result was a decade of unprecedented violence, with tens of thousands of deaths across Mexico. Still, Guzmán remained untouchable. He moved constantly between safe houses, traveling through remote mountain passes, protected by entire villages loyal to him. His network of informants alerted him. Whenever police or soldiers entered Sinaloa, bribes ensured that raids failed or were never launched. For years, he became a ghost, sighted occasionally, but always vanishing before authorities could close in. By the late 2000s, Guzmán's name was spoken in the same breath as Pablo Escobar. In 2009, Forbes magazine even listed him among the world's richest men, estimating his fortune at over $1 billion. The comparison was not accidental. Like Escobar, El Chapo had turned the drug trade into a global enterprise, one that reveled legitimate corporations in scale and sophistication. But his wealth and notoriety brought scrutiny. The United States increased pressure on Mexico to capture him, pouring resources into intelligence sharing. The DEA, the FBI, and Mexican Marines all turned their eyes toward Guzmán. For the first time, his aura of invincibility began to crack. This chapter of his life reveals the paradox of El Chapo Guzmán, a man who rose from a poor boy in Sinaloa to the undisputed kingpin of the Western Hemisphere. He was at once a folk hero and a mass murderer, a logistics mastermind, and a fugitive constantly on the run. By the early 2010s, he controlled the most powerful drug cartel in the world. But as history has shown, every empire has its limits, and every outlaw eventually faces capture. For El Chapo, that moment was fast approaching. The story of Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán cannot be told without his escapes. They were the defining moments of his legend, the daring episodes that transformed him from a powerful trafficker into a near mythical figure. While many cartel bosses fell to bullets or life sentences, El Chapo seemed to slip through fate's fingers again and again. Each escape embarrassed governments, enraged law enforcement, and deepened the sense that he was untouchable. His first true escape was in January 2001. After spending nearly 8 years in a maximum security prison, Guzmán had grown tired of confinement. Though technically locked away, he still commanded the Sinaloa cartel from behind bars. His money bought everything: special food, conjugal visits, even private parties inside the prison walls. Yet for a man used to roaming the Sierra Madre Mountains and orchestrating shipments across continents, prison was still a cage. So El Chapo did what he had always done. He planned. His bribery network extended to guards, administrators, and officials. On the night of January 19, 2001, he was hidden inside a laundry cart, wheeled past multiple checkpoints, and rolled out of the prison. The audacity was staggering. For the government, it was a humiliation. For the people, it was confirmation that Guzmán lived above the law. He vanished into the mountains, reuniting with his cartel and quickly reasserting control. The escape cemented his legend. Songs glorified him. His name whispered with reverence across Mexico. Authorities searched relentlessly, but for years they failed. Guzmán moved constantly, traveling by foot, by mule, and by helicopter. He was shielded by communities that depended on his money and feared his power. Government forces would surround a village, only to find that Guzmán had slipped out hours earlier, warned by loyal lookouts who formed a human shield of secrecy around him. During these years, El Chapo became a ghost. He lived in remote hutouts in the rugged Sierra Madre, accessible only by narrow mountain trails. His safe houses were outfitted with reinforced steel doors. secret escape tunnels, and even hydraulic lifts to whisk him away at the first sign of danger. He grew more careful, more paranoid, but his business thrived. The Sinaloa cartel expanded across Mexico, crushing rivals and dominating key smuggling routes. Then, in February 2014, came the unthinkable. Joaquín Guzmán was captured again. After more than a decade on the run, Mexican Marines, working with U.S. intelligence, tracked him to a seaside condominium in Mazatlan, Sinaloa. The operation was swift. Guzmán was arrested without a single shot fired. Images of him in handcuffs, disheveled and whisked away by armed soldiers, were broadcast worldwide. For the Mexican government, it was a triumph. They declared that the era of impunity was ending, that El Chapo's reign was finally broken. For a moment, it seemed true. Guzmán was placed in Altiplano, Mexico's most secure prison, a fortress designed to contain the country's most dangerous criminals. Cameras monitored his every move. Guards rotated constantly, and cell doors were made of reinforced steel. But if history had taught anything, it was that El Chapo never stayed caged for long. On the night of July 11, 2015, the impossible happened once more. Guzmán vanished from his cell. The security cameras showed him pacing, disappearing into his shower stall. Minutes passed, then hours. Guards finally opened the door. What they discovered shocked the world. Beneath the shower, a hole gaped open, leading to a mile-long tunnel. The tunnel was a marvel of engineering. Nearly 30 feet underground, it stretched 1.5 kilometers from the prison to a house under construction. It was fitted with lighting, ventilation, and a modified motorcycle mounted on rails to transport tools and supplies. Digging such a passage required money, expertise, and time, and all had been provided under the noses of Mexican authorities. Guzmán had once again outwitted the system, disappearing into the earth like a phantom. The escape made headlines around the globe. It was an embarrassment for Mexico's government, a direct challenge to its credibility. How could the most notorious trafficker, a live tunnel, his way out of a maximum security prison? Rumors swirled of corruption at the highest levels, of officials bought off or threatened into compliance. Guzmán, meanwhile, returned to his stronghold in Sinaloa, greeted as a hero by some, as an unstoppable force by others. The manhunt that followed was relentless. The DEA, the FBI, and Mexican Marines poured resources into tracking him down. Drones circled the mountains. Informants were cultivated, and electronic surveillance closed in. Yet Guzmán proved elusive. He was shielded by an army of gunmen and by the natural fortress of the Sierra Madre, where narrow trails and dense forests made pursuit nearly impossible. But as the months passed, cracks began to appear. Guzmán's confidence grew, and with it, his mistakes. Reports emerged that he had been in contact with Hollywood figures, hoping to see his life turned into a film. These conversations, carried out through intermediaries, exposed him to surveillance. U.S. and Mexican intelligence agencies tightened their net. In October 2015, Mexican Marines nearly captured him in Durango State. Guzmán slipped away through a tunnel, injuring himself during the escape. His wounds slowed him, forcing him to rely more heavily on his inner circle. By January 2016, intelligence pointed to a safe house in Los Mochis, Sinaloa. At dawn on January 8, Marines stormed the location. A firefight erupted, leaving 5 of Guzmán's men dead. El Chapo tried to flee through a sewer tunnel, but was cornered. This time, there was no escape. He was captured again, dragged into custody, and paraded before cameras. The difference now was that Mexico had learned its lesson. Officials feared another escape, another global humiliation. The United States had long demanded his extradition, arguing that only their prisons could hold him. After months of legal battles, the decision was made. On January 19, 2017, exactly 16 years after his first escape, Joaquín Guzmán was extradited to the U.S. For the first time in his life, El Chapo faced a system beyond his reach. American prisons were not like those in Mexico. Bribes could not buy freedom. Guards could not be persuaded. His escapes had made him a legend, but they had also sealed his fate. The U.S. government was determined that Joaquín Guzmán would never walk free again. The saga of El Chapo's escapes, the laundry cart, the tunnels, the manhunts, became chapters in the folklore of organized crime. To his admirers, they symbolized defiance, a poor man who outsmarted entire governments. To his victims, they were proof of the corruption and violence that had scarred Mexico for decades. And to the world, they were a reminder of the astonishing power one man could wield in the shadows. But legends cannot escape forever. For Guzmán, the walls were closing in. The courtroom awaited, and with it, the final judgment on his life of crime. By the time Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán was extradited to the United States in January 2017, the legend of the escape artist had ended. For decades, he had mocked governments, tunneled through prisons, and evaded manhunts. But in America, the walls were different, taller, thicker, and without cracks for bribes to seep through. Guzmán was locked inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City, under conditions so strict that even seasoned criminals described it as torture. His cell lights never dimmed, his visits were limited, and every step he took was monitored. For the first time in his life, El Chapo was truly caged. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational spectacles in the history of organized crime, officially known as United States v. Joaquín Guzmán Loera. It brought the world's most notorious trafficker into a Brooklyn federal courtroom. Prosecutors prepared mountains of evidence, intercepted phone calls, encrypted messages, photographs, videos, and testimony from former associates. Over 2 years, they assembled a case that portrayed Guzmán not merely as a trafficker, but as the ruthless CEO of a multinational criminal empire. The courtroom itself became a stage. Reporters filled the seats each day. Sketch artists captured Guzmán's every expression, and security was unprecedented. Armed marshals escorted him in armored vehicles. Helicopters patrolled overhead, and snipers were positioned on rooftops. The U.S. government was determined that there would be no third escape. The trial began in November 2018 and lasted nearly 3 months. 12 jurors, their identities kept secret for protection, listened as witness after witness peeled back the layers of the Sinaloa cartel. Former lieutenants, accountants, and smugglers testified, many of them having cut deals with prosecutors. Their stories painted a chilling portrait. Guzmán ordering executions, bribing generals, smuggling cocaine by the ton, and running a network that reached across continents. One witness described Guzmán's private zoo filled with exotic animals. Another recounted the gold-plated AK-47s and diamond-encrusted pistols he carried. A former mistress told the court how she helped him flee through tunnels, clinging to him as soldiers closed in. Perhaps most damning were the testimonies of his former right-hand men, who revealed the inner workings of the cartel with clinical detail. Guzmán's defense, by contrast, was weak. His lawyers argued that he was a scapegoat, that the real power lay with Ismael El Mayo Zambada, his longtime partner. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution traced billions of dollars in profits, showed encrypted communications intercepted by the FBI, and presented weapons and drugs seized in raids. Piece by piece, they dismantled the myth of El Chapo, the folk hero, and revealed El Chapo, the trafficker, murderer, and manipulator. Outside the courtroom, the trial fascinated the world. Every revelation became a headline. People debated whether Guzmán was a Robin Hood figure or a monster. Musicians wrote new narcocorridos about his fate. Netflix released documentaries inspired by his saga, and in Mexico, communities that once shielded him now faced brutal wars as rivals fought to claim the territory he had left behind. On February 12, 2019, the jury returned its verdict guilty on all counts. Guzmán was convicted of drug trafficking, money laundering, and participation in organized crime. The list of charges spanned decades of violence and smuggling. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. For the U.S. government, it was a resounding victory. For Guzmán, it was the end of the road. In July 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years, with an order to forfeit $12.6 billion, a symbolic figure meant to represent the profits of his empire. The judge spoke firmly. The overwhelming evil of your crimes is apparent. Guzmán, wearing a gray suit, listened quietly. There were no tunnels left, no guards to bribe, no laundry carts waiting. His legend had run out of escapes. He was transferred to ADX Florence, a Supermax prison in Colorado known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It is the most secure facility in the United States, home to terrorists, spies, and the most dangerous criminals in the world. Guzmán's cell measures 7 by 12 feet. He spends 23 hours a day inside, with only a small slit of a window to the sky. His communication with the outside world is almost non-existent. The man who once commanded armies, who dined with politicians, who moved tons of cocaine across continents, now eats meals alone on a steel tray in silence. But even as he sits in prison, the legacy of El Chapo endures. The Sinaloa cartel did not collapse with his capture. Instead, it adapted, led by new figures, including some of his own sons, known as Los Chapitos. Violence continues in Mexico, as rival groups like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel challenge Sinaloa's dominance. In many ways, Guzmán's imprisonment changed little on the ground. The drug trade persisted, the bloodshed continued, and the billions still flowed. Yet his story resonates as a symbol. For some, El Chapo represents the futility of the drug war, proof that removing one man cannot end a system fueled by poverty, corruption, and insatiable demand. For others, he is a villain whose greed and cruelty destroyed countless lives. His myth straddles both worlds. The outlaw admired in corridos and the criminal condemned in courtrooms. Perhaps the most striking part of his legacy is the contrast between his beginnings and his end. Born in poverty in the hills of Sinaloa, he rose through cunning, brutality, and vision to become one of the most powerful men in the world. He built an empire that reveled governments. Yet in the end, he was reduced to a prisoner in a cell, his empire fractured, his family pursued, his freedom gone forever. The story of Joaquín Guzmán is not just the tale of one man, but of a system that allowed him to rise. It is the story of corruption that stretches from village police to president's offices, of communities caught between poverty and cartel money, of demand in the United States that fueled supply in Mexico. His life encapsulates the dark dance between crime and power, between myth and reality. As he spends the remainder of his days in silence, far from the mountains of Sinaloa, the legend of El Chapo will continue to echo. But legends cannot alter the truth. His empire was built on blood, and his freedom was finally buried beneath the very system he once defied.